Okay. So, welcome everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland Delaware DC Press Association, and I am delighted to welcome you to the first session in our code switching series. We are joined today by Bruce Shapiro, who's the Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia University in New York, the Graduate School of Journalism. And the Dart Center does a lot of trainings and work around um, uh, trauma, both in terms of covering individuals and communities affected by trauma, but also the effects of trauma on journalism and the work. And so Bruce is here to talk to us about sort of best practices, kind of writ large for when you're doing investigations investigations and work in communities that have been affected by trauma. So with that, Bruce, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's great to be here with so many colleagues. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, my colleague Crystal Grow, who's in the background here, helping keep things going too. I am Bruce Shapiro. As Rebecca said, I direct the Darth Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia Journalism School. We've been around since 1999, and we're devoted to strengthening all kinds of reporting connected to trauma, violence, crisis, conflict, aftermath, everything from intimate partner violence and street crime all the way up to war and international human rights. A huge percentage of what we encounter in journalism and a huge percentage of what we report on involves individuals and families and communities who've experienced the worst things in life. And we need to understand that a little bit better. We need to understand it as a craft, as an ethical matter, and also we need to be thinking about how to take care of ourselves so that we stay resilient in the face of these difficult stories. I'm going to talk about all of that today, and I'll have, I think, plenty of time for conversation with all of you. Before I begin, though, it would be before I launch into kind of the more slightly prepared part and content heavy part of my conversation, it might be good to start out with even a bit of conversation through the chat, since you can't, I can't see your faces and all that, but I think using the chat function, it would be interesting to know what one or two things are that you hope to get out of today, and if you feel like throwing that into chat, something that brought you here today, instead of just going out and getting another flat white or some meeting a deadline or doing something else worthwhile. What brought you into a video conference conversation about covering trauma today? Any thoughts on that? I'll throw them into the chat. The chat button is on the right hand side of your Riverside screen. Covering communities without being exploitative. Excellent. What else you got? So, learning from Mel, learning how to be appropriate with sources who've been through a lot. That's so important, right? It's important and very difficult. Yeah, it is important and difficult work. And that, you know, that's why we're here to talk about it, right? What else? One or two more. From Laura, learn how to anticipate what traumas they might have gone through. From James, knowing when and how to approach a source after a traumatic event. James, that's so important in breaking situations in particular. It's a big challenge. Courtney says, I'm a public safety reporter, so cover crime a lot. I want to make sure I know how to properly interview sources who've been through traumatic situations and how to properly reflect their stories. And James again, whether and how to maintain contact with sources and follow up after publishing. From Ann Talent, I'm thinking about how frequently we're encountering community members in these situations. I've been doing from Christian. I'm doing journalism, community media interviews with a lot of people living in different communities and persons living with trauma, such as Indigenous people. and incest and sexual assault survivors. And I'm always looking to ameliorate my capacity to act in that context and listen to other people's practices. That's great, right? I mean, those really are, they go to the heart of the matter, why we're here today. If you want to keep putting things in, please do. I'm going to now throw up maybe the wrong thing to say right after lunch. I'm going to share my PowerPoint screen, um, and go through a few ideas, a bit of language, um, some principles, a bit of background in trauma science, actually, that can inform the choices that we make. And then we'll go back to conversation, hopefully with some time to share. Okay. So, hard stories, best practices in trauma aware reporting. Um, I want to say a bit about definition of terms. We do throw around this word trauma an awful lot in our society right now, right? Very casually, very different from when the Dart Center started its work, when the word trauma was not something we talked about in newsrooms or much of anywhere else. These days, we use it kind of casually to describe everything from losing your wallet up to war crimes. I mean something really very specific. Okay. When I talk about trauma, I'm thinking about psychological injury. I'm thinking about events and experiences involving really high levels of violence or horror or cruelty or persistent threat that overwhelm the capacity of individuals or families or communities to bounce back, to recover, and leave people with enduring changes, enduring psychological injuries, changes in the way people relate to the world, relate to themselves, relate to information that comes at them. If you use the phrase psychological injury kind of in your head, substitute that every time you see the word trauma or see the PTSD diagnosis, post traumatic stress disorder, you'll go a lot further toward understanding what we mean by trauma. Trauma isn't just about feeling bad, it's about injury, substantial change from threats, experiences coming from the outside that leave people permanently changed and impaired in some way. Um, and I'll also be using a bit this word resilience, another phrase that has become kind of a psychosocial buzzword right now. And resilience is also important to understand. Again, we use it casually, but I mean something very specific in the trauma science world that the Dart Center works in. Resilience is the capacity of individuals or families or communities to bounce back, to recover. Resilience is not about being unaffected by trauma. It's not the opposite of trauma or PTSD. It's about reserves that we all have encoded in our genes and reserves that we can nurture as professionals and nurture as human beings that enable us to contend with overwhelming stress and trauma and distress and cope and bounce back. We'll be talking about both things. Trauma and resilience can coexist, and that's very important. Okay. Briefly on the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, if you've never encountered us, we are part of Columbia Journalism School going back to 1999. We bring together our tribe of journalists with clinicians, neuroscientists, researchers in order to advance our best practice in reporting and in order to advance best practices in the support of trauma exposed news professionals. If you've never visited the Dart Center's website, www.dartcenter.org, please do so. It's got a vast library of tip sheets and backgrounders. Um, as I said at the top, clearly the theme bringing together all of your comments at the beginning is that covering violence, trauma, abuse is absolutely central to journalism. It's not just if it bleeds, it leads. It's not just that trauma sells newspapers or attracts clicks and eyeballs. It's that the most fundamental challenges facing our society have to do with violence and trauma. Do we go to war or not? What about crime? What about guns? What about gender violence? How do we protect children from abuse? Over and over and over again, you see that the issues which most deeply divide and deeply challenge our society involve trauma, and therefore the work that you all do as the capillary system for public understanding is central, right? Unfortunately, telling stories of trauma challenges us, right? It challenges our toolbox, it challenges sometimes our personal capacity. But there is good news, right? The good news is that we make choices every day, and these choices that we make in the course of reporting on trauma can be guided by science, by ethics, by our professional skills, by our special mission as journalists, not just long form journalism, that's it, as it says in this slide, but all kinds of reporting. Our understanding our mission makes a big difference in the strength of our reporting and our own resilience. It's also important to say that whenever we talk about trauma, identity is never neutral. Okay? We bring who we are to the party, the identities we wear on our skin, uh, the invisible identities we carry in our genes and in our family histories, our community histories of historic and present day trauma. All of that is part of who we are, and it's also part of the experiences of the folks we cover. So you can't escape uh, an overlapping sense of identity. Intersectional identity is crucial to this. We're not going to pretend there's a one size fits all answer to the trauma reporting equation. Okay. So, what I'm going to try to do today is introduce us a bit to the idea of trauma and resilience, a little bit on the brain science, not too much, because you have a much more qualified colleague than I am to talk about this coming, I think, on Wednesday. My colleague's Kate Porterfield, who's a clinical psychologist. Oh, and I didn't say at the top, I am not a psychologist. I am just a journalist. I've been doing this work for a long time, so it's a great pleasure to get to hang out with brain scientists, but all I really am is a reporter and editor, and I share with you my excitement, my frustration, my concerns that come with reporting on difficult issues. Anyway, I'm going to talk a bit about the craft of reporting on trauma, about vulnerable sources, about issues that arise with verification and storytelling and ethics, and also I'm going to talk a bit about how we take care of ourselves. Okay. Let me start here. I think something again that united the questions you raised at the beginning is that trauma is such a kind of emotional and challenging issue for us in reporting because it puts our ethical and personal commitments into big tension with one another, right? It really confounds our usual judgment. What do I mean? Well, if there is, unfortunately, a school shooting, some of you are going to race out to that scene, and it's critical that you get the story fast, but it's also critical that you get it accurately. The stakes are so high with that kind of a traumatic event. We need to get information from witnesses, and yet we want to make sure they know who we are and that they consent. We want to talk to survivors, and yet we don't want to re-traumatize them. Trauma constantly puts our commitments into high tension with one another, and that can leave us feeling a little bit dazed and confused, like this poor snow monkey here. um, it really begins, I think, with the fact that whenever we're reporting on trauma, right, we're reporting on people who, whatever their original social status, socioeconomic status, have been deprived of basic safety, basic power and agency over their own safety or the safety and well-being of people they love or identify with closely. And then when you that gets compounded by economic inequality, by historic and present day racism, by gender inequity, every other inequity in our profoundly unequal society, the result can mean a huge gap between a reporting toolkit that is really designed to be very effective for people who have more power than we do, mayors, police chiefs, generals, senators, um, and folks who have been deprived of basic safety. This is Philonis Floyd, Mr. George Floyd's brother, someone who never expected that he would be at the center of the world's TV cameras and microphones, or surrounded by some of the most influential political figures in American history. And yet here he is bearing witness. His brother lost his life. His brother was murdered. He himself, Philonis Floyd, was not able to protect his brother. This is the terrain of trauma, of radical disempowerment, radical loss of safety and agency. It's a special kind of listening, and it's also a special kind of witnessing, because when we are listening to survivors of trauma, we're not just extracting facts and quotes, not just doing what Louis Raven Wallace calls extractive journalism. We are there to co-witness. We are there to stand with the survivors of trauma and carry their story to the world, whether that is from street crime or, as in this photo, from the Haiti earthquake in Port-au-Prince in 2010. This photo was taken by my friend Ron Haviv from the Seven Photo Agency, and I love this haunting image. Here you've got a gentleman doing the most normal thing in the world, sitting outside in a folding chair, talking eye to eye with a journalist, in this case, a journalist with a camera. And yet around him is comprehensive loss and devastation. And so often that's the literal nature of encounter with survivors. They've lost everything, yet there we are having what feels like a normal conversation with them. It can be very disconcerting. And of course, survivors are not always surrounded by this level of literal devastation, but very often their psychic landscape is just as devastated as the physical landscape of Port-au-Prince in the aftermath of that horrific quake. What it comes down to is that individuals across lines of language and culture who have experienced violence and abuse are different from other sources. And I think you all know this. There are some characteristic ways that we're going to encounter over and over again, right? People who've been profoundly traumatized may have difficulty establishing trust, right? Hold too much back, or thrust the opposite, thrust too much trust at us, just dump on us or start treating us like they're therapists. They may seem like that man in the photo from Haiti, have a 1,000-yard stare, or maybe too intensely present, maybe very fragmented in their speech, have a difficulty holding a storyline together, or the opposite, be really stuck in it, maybe awash in shame and guilt, equally awash in anger or betrayal. And all of you have probably experienced this. People either with one of these characteristics or several of them in a kind of a whipsaw. People who on an investigative project are with you and then suddenly pull back, kind of running hot and cold, or who are with you, then get really angry at you, um, or who resist fact checking even when you need to do it. All these things. The question is why. Okay, and I'm not, as I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on brain science because you'll be hearing from my colleague Kate Porterfield on Wednesday. But the roots of these psychological injuries that make trauma survivors so challenging to work with are in the idea that enormously fear inducing, threat evoking events that overwhelm our regular capacity strike people on three levels at once: biological, psychological, and social. Trauma is a biopsychosocial experience, or even a biopsychosocial injury that goes to some ways of relating that we rely on a lot in our sources, right? Biological trauma begins with the biology of fear and the resources that a body mobilizes in the face of threat, both the kind of hyper arousal, adrenaline, norepinephrine, fight or flight responses, and the opposite, the freeze, the shutdown, the numbing that enables people to stay calm or pain free through enormously distressing episodes, or dissociate through who's to take themselves out of body in episodes of torture or sexual assault. Right? Those are biological responses to threat that help us stay alive. We are meaning making creatures who make meaning of distressing experiences as well as good ones. And we're also social creatures who connect to one another, and all of those are wiring. But real trauma blows the valves so that the fear reactions or the numbing reactions that are evoked in a car wreck or in an assault or in war or in torture, those fear reactions can be so easily evoked by seemingly unrelated experiences that are all coded somehow into memory. And that in turn can lead to meaning making changes. It's common in trauma survivors not only to be a little too jumpy or really down and negative or swinging between those things, but also to have darkened their worldview, to become profoundly negative, to see nothing but bad outcomes or presume bad news everywhere. And then there's the social, and I think this actually has particular consequences for us as journalists. We are all wired to rely pretty heavily on a basic social contract. When I'm through with you folks, I'm going to walk across the street, across Orange Street in New Haven, Connecticut, to Nika's Market, my lovely little neighborhood grocery, to get some kale for dinner tonight. And between here and that market, a block away, an awful lot has to go right, right? I have to assume that none of the cars going up and down my street are going to run me down. I have to presume that none of my many enemies are waiting outside Nika's to beat the crap out of me. I got to assume that when I go in the store to get my kale, there's nobody packing with a crazy grievance that they're determined to take out on random strangers in the world. An awful lot has to go right between me and my kale. And we go through life dealing with that. But the trauma survivor, that family who's lost a child in a school shooting, that child who's lost a parent to police violence, that soldier who had their buddy destroyed next to them in war, that torture survivor, is someone for whom the world is no longer as safe as it was, right? That child abuse victim. These are people for whom trust is harder than it is for other people because the world has proven that it's not a very safe place. And we run into that like a buzzsaw when we report on folks. We run into people who may perceive danger where there isn't any, who are flooded by memory or who block memory, who will go to great lengths to avoid routine experiences and stresses that might threaten to evoke traumatic memory, or who may feel profoundly isolated and negative because of the extremity of their experience. Okay. You're going to talk on Wednesday in depth with Kate Porterfield about interviewing. But I want to get really practical now, and I will talk briefly about interviewing before I move on to some other things. The first thing I want to say is this. Very often now I'm asked, especially by younger reporters, aren't we automatically re traumatizing survivors when we ask them about stuff they went through, whether it was an hour ago or 30 years ago? Isn't interviewing about trauma automatically a kind of emotional labor that it may not be our um, role to, to ask? Are we asking people to damage themselves when we interview them? And on this, I'm actually able to give perhaps a reassuring answer that is rooted in brain science and research. All of the evidence that we have from years of studies from many disciplines of people being interviewed about trauma is that while trauma can be talking about trauma can be emotionally challenging, can evoke short-term distress, it can also be valuable. There's an important difference, it turns out, between short-term distress evoked by recollecting trauma and long-term psychological injury. There is no evidence that being interviewed about trauma in and of itself worsens the mental health outcome for our sources. Okay, and in fact, there's evidence that when it goes right, it can be a really valuable experience. There was a famous study of torture victims in Chile some decades ago. Some who chose to be interviewed by the country's Truth Commission, some who chose not to. Psychologists followed them over time afterwards, and on the whole, those who chose to be interviewed did better in the long run. And this has been shown again in other studies since then. There can be something, survivors have told me that there can be something profoundly comforting, even when it's hard, in being listened to, in being believed, in having your story go out to the world, especially when it's a story that there are big stakes in keeping suppressed, stories about racism or gender violence or institutional abuses, um, that leave people feeling profoundly isolated. As reporters, we can build a bridge between folks and society, and that's a real thing. We also know that since we know that trauma memory can evoke these strong responses, we can think about ways of mitigating the impact. We can think about the community context, whether we're talking to someone about a kind of a one off event that happened to them alone or an experience they share with others, and where there are other people, a community of sufferers who we need to be talked to. Where I've come down actually after looking at the brain science, listening to psychologist colleagues, is less concerned about re traumatizing per se, and more when we're reporting on survivors. I worry more specifically about that social axis, about reenacting betrayal or loss of control. If we understand every trauma survivor as someone who the world did not keep safe, as someone who sometimes has suffered physically at the hands of another, whether it's in sexual abuse, gender violence, war, crime, police violence, whatever it is, when other human beings have victimized folks, that's a profound social betrayal. And as I said, everyone has lost control over their own safety. So when we march in and unintentionally remind people of how unsafe the world is. If we show up late, something that would be a second tier issue in another interview. If we forget to call back when we said we were going to call back. If we otherwise show, if our attention flags during an interview, all of that kind of thing can be evidence, a reminder of how unsafe the world is, and that can reenact that sense of betrayal and loss of control. And that's when people feel really hurt by reporters. It's important to think about that. So, what is the basics of interviewing, trauma aware interviewing? And again, you'll be doing a lot of this in great depth with Kate Porterfield on Wednesday. It's a great, great talk that she gives. So, I really urge you to spend some time with her. The basic principle, as far as I'm concerned as a reporter, is looking for ways to give some agency, control, and power back to our reporting subjects. In a breaking news situation, that can be really hard, but at a minimum, it means making sure that people know who we are, that we are calibrating as best we can, how safe they are, stuff like that. The no surprise rule is really important. You think of all trauma survivors, whether it's something recent or something that happened decades ago, as someone whose internal alarm system, internal car alarm, if you will, is queued up a little bit too high, like a car alarm that goes off at the beating of a sparrow's wing, right? That's what trauma does. Subtle reminders, the color of the sky, the humidity in the air, can really get people going. So the more we can do to avoid surprise, tell people how long we're going to spend with them. Say things like, "Hey, I'm going to start taking notes now, if that's okay." Um, Say, "Hey, do you want your therapist in this interview with you?" Which you wouldn't do for like Donald Trump or the guy in the White House, right? Um, those things matter. Seeking unusual levels of permission. If it's someone who's been through something really frightening, thinking hard about where to interview them. If it was someone who had a horrible experience in a confined, closed space, you don't want to pick your favorite intimate, closed cafe or a bar. You want to find a wide open public space that feels safer, right? Um, After that 2010 earthquake, I went to Haiti after that to do some work with journalists. One of my psychologist colleagues and I went, and the very nice NGO that brought us down, the first day of our workshops for journalists, organized it in a fully intact, very safe hotel that had a conference room that had not been touched by the quake. None of the reporters could focus. None of them could physically bear to be there. All of them had had their homes and offices crumble around them. Being inside was physically impossible for them. So the next day we moved it outside. Everybody was calm. It was fine. It was great. Think about what safety means to your subject. When there's time, if it's not just breaking news, carefully explain what you're doing, how you work in a very non technical way. Again, your goal is to be lowering people's sense of threat and alarm, particularly folks who normally don't deal with the press. You're trying to create a sense of collaboration. Collaborative journalism rather than extractive journalism is the key to building trusting relationships with folks who've been through trauma. And again, this is going to vary a bit depending on what stage your reporting is at, and we can talk about that, but it's where it begins. Another key issue with profoundly vulnerable sources, traumatized sources, people who've been through violence, um, is boundaries. If people, especially after sexual violence, torture, but also sometimes after gun violence and other issues, um, trauma survivors sometimes have a hard time knowing who to trust or where to trust, and that can lead to some confusion in boundaries with reporters. Sources sometimes may start imposing inappropriate trust on us. After all, we're the first people to really listen and believe them. Or they may also have that fast kindling betrayal that turns into a conflagration in seconds. And this can be very risky for us as reporters. People can put unethical or unrealistic demands on us. Think back to the famous, now 10 years ago, Rolling Stone University of Virginia sexual assault story, which, among other things, involved a source putting unrealistic and unethical demands on a reporter, which a reporter felt drawn into accepting. Um, you don't want to be people's therapist. You're not, right? You don't want to get caught up in dramas where people are trusting you and then angry at you and betray you and then feel betrayed and then go back and forth and swing back and forth. You don't want to get attacked on social media if you can avoid it. So thinking about both our professional sources, professional boundaries, just explaining your role, sometimes educating folks about why you need to ask them for verification, explaining how the editing process works, that can really matter. It really matters sometimes to be able to turn off your phone and say, I saw you called at 8 o'clock last night. I never pick up the phone after 7. I'll always call you back the next day. Feel free to leave a message. All those kinds of little professional things, keeping a notebook or a big legal pad, which is what I do now, really visible during a trauma interview, really can remind people who you are. Okay. The thing to remember is that maintaining boundaries actually helps vulnerable sources. People who are having emotional difficulty, whether from trauma or anything else, aren't actually helped by everyone accommodating their needs. No one is helped when their emotional distress drives the car. So when you calmly maintain your professionalism, even if it's sometimes challenging, you're actually helping sources in the long run. Clearly, there are profound ethical stakes raised by trauma. What is the meaning of consent? In a breaking news sense, in a story where there people have a lot of emotional distress, how do we verify? How do we portray people, survivors, with dignity? How do we keep sources safe? And what about our ethical responsibility to our readers, our viewers, our listeners, our downloaders? Um, I think that there's a kind of really profound but also very straightforward trauma reporting ethics toolkit that we can follow. Okay. It's really a few principles. The first and most important is, whose story is this anyway? We have a wonderfully acquisitive vocabulary in our profession. Hey, Rebecca, that was a great story you got yesterday. Hey, I got the greatest picture. It's all acquisitive, right? And that's fine. That's how we should talk. But remember that when you're reporting on trauma, there is really only one person whose story it is, and that's the survivor. They're the ones who have to live with it. And it's easy to forget that, okay? Transparency and the no surprise rule. Being clear about who you are and why you're there. Even if it's breaking news, identify yourself, explain what you're doing. If it's a feature, an investigation, a longer form story, talk about what the process will be like. Again, that no surprise rule. Not over promising the outcome. The stakes in accuracy, routine accuracy, is so important on trauma stories. Let's say you accidentally misspell Uncle Jack's name in a story, and Uncle Jack is like a third tier character in the feature. In any other kind of story, that would be annoying, but eh. in a trauma story, it becomes profound indication that you are not to be trusted and that the world is not to be trusted. For the same reason, keeping your promises, right? Showing up when you say you're going to show up. If you say you're going to call back, call back. That is so important as a statement of your ethical commitment to your sources. If there's verification issues, fact checking, needing to corroborate stories, you want to talk about that very directly and openly with your sources. You don't want to procrastinate on it, right? It's If there's one thing I've learned, it's that if people aren't willing to work with you on the corroboration that you need, even on very sensitive matters, um, it means they're not going to be ready for prime time when a story is published. So you want to pay a lot of attention to that. Accepting the complexity of trauma survivors is so hard and so important. Trauma does not turn people into saints. Suffering does not turn people into saints. It turns them into complicated and contradictory people. People can have suffered a lot and also be really difficult. People can be victims and perpetrators. All of that complexity is part of trauma reporting, and you really don't want to give it up when you encounter any kind of an ethics question in your reporting on trauma, whether it's about how much verification or can I believe this source or how do I handle this demand, whatever it is, the key thing is not to solve it in your own head, is to talk it out with a trusted colleague. Over and over and over again, big um, scandals in journalism have occurred when some reporter covering a very sensitive trauma related matter decided to solve the problem themselves rather than talk it out. It's just a bad idea. You want to socialize the problem. Content advisories, very interesting question. This is actually a contended area in trauma science. Um, there was a feeling a few years ago, and where trigger warning sort of started, is that if people have PTSD, then encountering unbidden a whole lot of graphic imagery or detail in a news story might trigger their PTSD, might get them going, might be really harmful to people, and so PTSD survivors should have the right to turn away. Research doesn't actually support that finding. The research on that suggests that for people who actually have PTSD, um, I won't get into the science on it, but for people who actually have PTSD, trigger warnings may increase their kind of avoidance and hinder recovery rather than help recovery. But I think if we think of content advisories rather than trigger warnings and say, should any, as an ethical matter, any reader, viewer, listener, have a sense of control and agency over what they're going to watch, I think that's a reasonable ethical commitment to all news consumers. And that's an argument for light content advisories on the scale of what they sometimes do on NPR now, which I think is pretty good. Um, Someone asked about breaking stories at the top, and it's very important to think about this, that our trauma reporting toolkit is going to be a little bit different depending on the phase of the story, right? Because our toolkit is a little bit different. One of my colleagues, a psychiatrist named Frank Ochberg, years ago defined what he called the three acts of trauma news. There's the breaking news phase, there's the aftermath or recovery phase, which goes on for a long time, and then there's Act Three, long term and enduring change to individuals or families or society as a whole. Breaking news is fairly obvious. Aftermath and recovery is really an awful lot of the longer features and anniversary stories and all that we do. Um, Act Three, I think maybe we are in Act Three of the Sandy Hook shooting now, where the long tail of trauma, the long tail of disinformation, the long tail of legal challenges is only just becoming clear, right? Each phase, my colleague Frank Ochberg said, demands a different toolkit because we have a different job. In the breaking news phase, you're trying to find out the basics of what has happened in order to communicate it to the community so the community mobilizes resources, whether that's first responders, whatever, and also in the kind of immediate aftermath understands the causes as best we can so that we come up with the right solutions to keep it from happening again, right? The recovery phase, that's where things like paying attention to the psychological arc of PTSD comes in. It's where community recovery comes in. at all of that, and that's where some of the deeper interview skills come in. And then there's that act three when you're really invoking history, social change, all kinds of complicated stuff. And which toolkit you use will vary a lot. It's worth thinking as you're working on a trauma drenched story. Am I in act one? Am I in act two? Or am I in act three? Because you'll come to different conclusions about your job. There's a lot of storytelling challenges, narrative challenges, regardless of whether you're working primarily in print and website, sentences and paragraphs, or primarily in audio or primarily in video. Um, Telling difficult stories involves some unusual tensions. We do want our readers, viewers, listeners to pay attention, yet we don't want to be exploitative and sensational. We want to give them a chance to think, not just feel. We want to avoid cliches of trauma survivors and yet involve people emotionally. We want to portray people with dignity and yet be honest about the challenges trauma survivors often face. We want to lay out lines of accountability for recovery so that we're not just focusing on the day to day of violence, but looking at the long arc of recovery and what kinds of community resources it takes, what kinds of social investments, etc. We want to be dealing in an upfront way with the way historical trauma can leap across generations and inflect today's politics. And we also have an opportunity to report on trauma or PTSD as a public health issue, right? We need to be educating our readers and viewers and listeners. We need to be helping hold government and corporations accountable and society accountable for providing the right mental health resources. All of these are considerations when you're reporting on trauma, even in a breaking news context. And what about us? I want to spend just a few minutes now looking at the other side of trauma aware reporting, which is the impact on us as news professionals and how we can kind of contemplate our own resilience and get to someplace more useful. And to begin this part of the conversation, I would invite you to think for a few minutes, look for a couple seconds at the beautiful west coast of County Clare in Ireland and breathe slowly 3 times, which is partly my way of just kind of slipping in an intermission slide, but also actually because thinking about images, thinking about breath, thinking about the pacing of difficult information is a big part of how we take care of ourselves as journalists. Okay, we are in a trauma facing profession, and we need to acknowledge that. It's not just mayhem you may witness on the street in a shooting or in a violent demonstration or the attack on the Capitol, though that is very difficult. We are also spending enormous amounts of time engaged in empathetic connection with profoundly vulnerable sources and communities. We are working with far more graphic imagery than has ever been the case in journalism before. That open pipeline of social media and body cam video and everything else. We are dealing with a level of threat and abuse and harassment directed at our profession that has not been the case in the modern U.S. before. We are doing this over a career, and we're so often doing stories about things that make ourselves feel unsafe or breach our own sense of what's just and right in the world. 20 years of studies of journalists show that through all of these channels, we as a profession at every stage of our careers and on every beat are exposed to far more trauma than the general public. That's just reality. But and of course it's mediated as well by job stress and by the overall negativity of news cycles now. But it's also very important to know that the same 20 years of studies also show us something else. That as a profession, we are a profoundly resilient tribe. That while trauma exposure in journalism is higher than the general population, the rates of PTSD are actually nowhere near what you would expect under the circumstances. It turns out we may often experience short-term distress, but most of the time we will return to our equilibrium. Most of the time we'll be okay. It turns out, and this is really important, that the very job which exposes us to trauma in a routine way also includes some measurable, significant resilience factors. having a job to do in the face of mayhem and violation, having craft skills that make sense of the world, having a sense of mission and purpose and ethics, most of all, having trusted colleagues. All of these are measurable buffers that help mitigate the impact of toxic stress and trauma. And we can build up those things. The challenge is that when our personal levy is overtopped, when psychological injury does finally become too much, when all the protective factors aren't enough, it can be singularly toxic. The very mechanisms involved in trauma, in that biopsychosocial matrix, are those that we rely on most, right? If you think about trauma survivors, people who are spending too much time feeling too jumpy, right? Well, we rely on our ability to stay focused, calm, put together complex information. People who are feeling too down, too withdrawn, too numb, we need to connect. We need to be really present in the moment. Think about people whose worldview becomes deeply negative. We depend on our news judgment, a balanced news judgment, right? Or think about breaking down of social trust. We rely as journalists in a profound way on the ability to make trusting connection with our sources, with our colleagues, with readers, viewers, listeners, downloaders. We're in a trust based, a social profession. And when that is undermined by psychological injury, it can really undo a journalist's capacity. It's very important to say that all of that I just said about trauma exposure and its risks applies not just to the direct exposure to trauma, but to the secondary trauma that comes at us through our computer screens. There is a lot of evidence, 20 years of studies, showing that the relentless and unbounded professional exposure to graphic content can be a pathway to the same trauma reactions, the same psychological injury as direct trauma exposure. Our brain interprets a steady flow of graphic imagery that we must look at for our work with its threat and danger circuitry, especially if we're too tired, too stressed out, have too much other trauma kicking around there already. And it leads to exactly the same reactions. When you hear people talk about sometimes secondary PTSD, that's not a different kind of PTSD or a different kind of trauma. It's exactly the same trauma reactions. It's secondary only in physical proximity to the stressor. Okay? So if you're feeling distressed by your work and you've never been out on the street, but you have been dealing with a lot of toxic content, take that seriously, right? It's really, really important. The interesting thing is that the biopsychosocial markers of journalists' uh, psychological injuries are pretty obvious because the mechanisms of concentration and focus and trust and getting on with colleagues and making meaning and news judgment are so basic to our work. When trauma does get to us, we can it doesn't take years on the couch. We can see it most often in the form of persistent change in workplace performance. People who've been good at deadline who begin to blow it, people who have been collegial who become gnarly, difficult, colleagues who are sharply focused who become really spacey, down, disconnected. And note that word persistent. I'm not talking about a bad day or a bad week. Weeks on end, months on end. That's what I mean by persistent change as an early warning sign that the trauma's impact is taking hold. And you do want to pay attention because at the far end of that can be journalists who become chronic risk takers in order to feel anything, who drive all their colleagues crazy by never being able to meet a deadline in a kind of avoidance spin cycle, or who self-medicate or really lose the plot and become really combative or lose their news judgment, right? You don't want to go there. You want to pay attention. For that reason, I have come to believe that all of us as news professionals need a basic, simple self care plan, which is not a luxury, which is not a woo woo, new agey thing, but is as baked into our professional practice as and as important to our professional success as verifying facts and checking quotes and putting together stories. I imagine that the Maryland, D.C. Press Club is not yet ready to install the hot tub with snow monkeys. Rebecca, we can talk about that after the Zoom. But we can get there anyway. There are some very simple principles for journalist self care plan while we're waiting for the snow monkeys. Okay, the first is just knowing your own signs, really being conscious about it. What does a good day feel like? What does a bad day feel like? What gets you from bad to good? What has helped you in the past? And what do you know is going to probably send you hurtling down a well of grumpiness, right? It's really important to know that and to have a plan for those times when you see yourself kind of approaching the brink. Pacing the trauma load. Sometimes that means alternating the kinds of stories that you do if you have that luxury. Sometimes within a particular story, or if you're doing a big edit with a lot of graphic video, it means half an hour on, 15 minutes off, getting other images in your head. There's a lot. We'll talk more about what pacing means. Limiting technology. This is really important. Okay, I love my phone, but the smartphone is just a neurological arousal device. Okay, every Amazon news alert, every Amazon sales notice, every news alert, every tweet that gets your phone buzzing, right, is also getting your brain buzzing. That's the whole business model of the smartphone, and that's great if your 401k is in like Apple and AT&T. It's really lousy if we're immersed in news cycles that already have us at a high state of alert and dealing with difficult imagery. It's very important to turn off your phone. I put mine on the other side of the bedroom an hour before bed. I've turned off alerts to anything that is not absolutely critical and set up do not disturb times when only my family and one or two key people can get through. Um, be, Being in control of technology is really important. Staying biologically grounded and lowering our biological arousal. This is really important. There's a lot of research showing that exercise activities involving deep rhythmic breathing and physical grounding of the body. So, aerobic exercise, swimming, running, cycling, but also yoga, meditation, mindfulness, all of those lower our biological arousal and our neurological arousal. They help prevent the over-consolidation of stress responses, the over-consolidation of fear reactions and graphic imagery. It's a critical part of any journalist self-care plan. Limiting substance use. If any of you met me a couple weeks ago at IRE, you might have noticed that I am not a Puritan in these matters, but alcohol really does interfere with proper consolidation of and of trauma, of traumatic material and memories. It interferes with sleep, which means we're much more vulnerable to PTSD. There's a very high correlation between self medication with alcohol and higher risk of PTSD. You really want to be paying attention with that. The most important thing, study after study, is positive collegial connection, peer support among journalists. Every study of news professional around the world shows the same thing. The single factor most associated with journalist resilience is trusting collegial connection and other social support. The single biggest risk factor for PTSD and other psychological injury, burnout, etc., is social isolation. And that means we need to really pay a lot of attention to our social networks. We need to be engaging through groups like the Press Club here in Maryland and DC. We need to be going to conferences. We also need to be structuring our engagement with colleagues since we are still so much working at home, dispersed. We need to really be thinking about who are the colleagues I need to touch base with routinely, who are our mentors, who can I trust if I need to just talk something through. It's really important. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to shut up there and we can have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to turn off sharing. If I can figure out how to do that. There we go. There we go. Wonderful going into chat now. I see there are some questions. Yes, the deck will be available. Absolutely. I see that as a question. Best advice for a young reporter attacked for reporting bad acts by the accused family members. Okay, so this is very important, and it happens a lot. It's always happened a lot, but it's more true, more of a problem now than it's ever been. You know, first of all, I hate to say this, but we need to, each of us as journalists and as a professional community, do need to have a bit of a safety plan. Okay. Now, what that safety plan is depends on what kind of reporting you do and what beat you cover and all that sort of thing. But um, you know, it does involve some basic things. One of them involves social media. We really need to be protecting. We need to have safe social media zones. I think a great exercise is doxing yourself. See what can be found on you online, and clean it up if you can, because you want to be not so easily reachable by people who may wish you harm. Um, I think if you are attacked, it depends what you mean by attacked. If you're criticized by the accused family members, I think unfortunately that comes with the terrain. But I think, and sometimes the best response is to not respond. They're going to do what they're going to do. But I do think it's okay if you're talking to someone from that family to explain what your job is, to explain that you report both sides, to explain that you're reporting on what the court is saying, and explain that you want to get their perspective across. I don't think you should automatically feel afraid of criticism from highly emotional family members, but at the same time, it's really important to think about what your zones of vulnerability are, and if you find someone is coming to your house, or if they're calling you at odd hours or something, you want to pay attention to that. Um, Christian asks, "What are you doing when your colleagues, and particularly people who have authority on you and your work, are not doing a good job of taking care of themselves, and that has an impact on you?" Christian, this is really important. We all work in newsrooms where sometimes our bosses or our colleagues are setting a race to the bottom in self care, where they are burning the candle at both ends and are calibrating expectations really low. Um, I would say a couple things on this. So, one is, in a newsroom, first of all, recognize that we are all one another's role models. And um, if you can find ways of putting up some boundaries and practicing some self care, that's a good thing. If there are multiple people who see this as a problem, who understand with you that there are unrealistic expectations in the workplace, you can deal with it together. You can go as a group to newsroom management, to those in authority. Sometimes, I know managers who think they're being really caring, who send out messages about people should take care of themselves, and yet at the same time, those same managers are working 24/7 and are clearly giving the message that there's only one real way to get ahead in this business, and that's to burn yourself out. Um, you know, I think that this is a crisis in our industry, frankly, Christian, and it needs to be dealt with at three levels. Media owners need to see that there are real liabilities, that people are going to get sued, that this is an occupational health and safety risk. Burnout and PTSD are occupational health and safety issues. Managers need to understand that the mental health of their reports is part of their job, and that indeed their own well-being as managers depends on a degree of self-care, on thinking in a granular way through the team's work and how to make it more sustainable is really important. And at the newsroom floor, as individuals, we do need to take some responsibility for our own self care, but also addressing these issues together. I have seen newsrooms change their culture profoundly. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a few people willing to confront it. Christian, if you're in a newsroom, I would urge you to think about who your allies are, rather than just go headbutting up against a boss, someone who has authority, who you think is not sensitive to these. I would think about who your allies are. There's training that managers can get. We do that training at the Dart Center. There are other folks who do. There's also, I think, basic self care training like this for entire newsrooms can help establish a culture. That's really important. Um, you know, Ultimately, what we're finding now is that many newsrooms that never paid any attention to trauma, burnout, etc., before are becoming quite focused on it. The levels of burnout in our profession are high. Newsrooms are scared by it. They're also, I think, scared of their liability. So suddenly, we're at the Dart Center. We're seeing a flood of requests for newsrooms for conversations like this one, Christian, and it's a culture change thing. You got to start one step at a time, but think about, and it's hard to know how to answer more specifically without knowing your particular situation, but think about who else is affected by the situation. Think about who some allies might be. Think about what one small victory would be that moves things a little bit closer toward culture change.
Right.
Anyone else have thoughts or queries into the chat on this? Rebecca, if you saw anything, feel free to.
I'm blown away by your ability to look through a chat and present at the same
Oh, it's
time. We did get
three
to.
3 years of Zoom. It's not from anything good. It's just COVID knowledge. um,
So let's see. Oh, and we did talk a little bit. I think we covered the best advice for a young reporter who was attacked
yeah,
by accused family members. Or
I think. Look,
so.
I think it's important to remember in those circumstances. It depends what you mean by attacked, right? It is important to know in those circumstances that family members may themselves be experiencing or have experienced a lot of trauma. Understand that they're going to be emotional. We do need to deal with that, and just sometimes it means saying, I'm sorry you feel that way. Here's my number. Sometimes it means saying, I do want to get your perspective across. Would you be willing to sit down for an interview and just really do your prep for that? But sometimes it means having a safety plan, right? Without knowing what you mean by attacked, it's hard to know.
Well, and I think also there's situations where, and this happens more and more, especially on social media, where there'll be comments, there'll be outright pushes against a reporter, and so I think your advice earlier about essentially doxing yourself to see what's available online,
Yeah,
but then
that's really
also
important.
uh, we've talked in different trainings about how to kind of get the purpose of journalism across. That it's part of a journalist's
Yep.
job to ask different questions and look at different perspectives and
Yep.
report on the events, whether or
Yeah.
not they're
Yeah.
particularly they're
Now,
not pro or
I would
contra.
say on the social media side, I would say um, that if you are being systematically piled on social media, it's very important that you have a little bit of a self care plan for this. And one of those things may be limiting your social media engagement when there's a lot of piling on going on, because it's toxic and you don't need it. It's not going to make your reporting any better, right? The In some newsrooms that I'm aware of, when there's been a kind of campaign directed at a reporter by a family members or of an accused or by politicians or by whatever, um, the newsroom has helped the reporter hand off their social media accounts to someone else who handles them for a couple of weeks until things calm down, and we'll let you know if there's anything really important that comes across. But it's I think um, when the attack is primarily coming through social media, the very best thing you can do is really set up boundaries and get your brain out of it. We have a problem in our industry, which is that, of course, sometimes we're evaluated on the basis of our social media engagement, and that's not good. Okay, but it's important that you not let those voices live in your head. And we do have our normal social lives on social media, unfortunately, and that means that for a lot of reporters, you go onto your account and trying to find your friends and family, and it's filled with sludge from the people who you've reported on. It's
Mhm.
really, really important to put boundaries up. I believe that reporters who do have significant social media, social lives, I'm not so much one of those people who need two social media accounts. One for your private life, maybe even with a variant on your name or something. It's not so easily identified. And one that's your verified professional identity where people can throw all the rocks at you they want. Um, can you become a member of your organization without having been a journalist student at Columbia? We have no members. We're just a center. Yes. Um, we sign up for our email list. Sign up for. I'll put our Twitter handle. We are the Dart Center is um, organized for the benefit of the entire journalist community around the world. Okay, we are designed to foster innovation in our field, and we try to bring together people at every stage of their careers across lines of country and language and culture. So no, you don't. In fact, while I love my students at Columbia, they are probably the smallest part of what we do at the Dart Center. Most of what we do are conversations like this, trainings in newsrooms, awards and fellowships for working journalists. We do have a wonderful program, the Dart Center Ochberg Fellowship, which is an annual week-long seminar program for 15 journalists from all over the world, bring them to Columbia. We just completed this year's, but you should watch out for that. We have other special interest fellowships on things like reporting on early childhood, reporting on gun violence in the past.
Mhm.
Watch out for those opportunities as they arise. We also sometimes do webinars, have other kinds of events that are open to the entire journalism community. And Christian, I see your note about Quebec. And a student at the University of Ottawa. We are actually currently working with the CBC and some professors at Ryerson in Canada on trauma journalism tools that the CBC would produce, trauma aware reporting tools that the CBC would produce. So you'll be hearing more from us in Canada soon. There's also a great group called the Canadian Forum on Violence and Trauma, Canadian Forum on Trauma and Journalism, something like that, which is a really lovely, wonderful group. You should be in touch with them.
So
Other
as we start to wind down, and if you have more questions, please put them in the chat. But I know we have some interns, some early in career journalists, some more veteran reporters, and some editors. How do you suggest that newsroom editors kind of solidify these trauma practices within their own newsrooms? Is it more, is
Mm.
it sort of, okay, we have this story that may impact people from traumatized communities, how game plan it, or how do you suggest editors navigate these issues?
Yeah, it's really challenging and interesting. So the first thing I would say is go to the Dart Center website, which I'll put into the chat, www.dartcenter.org, which has massive tip sheets, backgrounders, all kinds of stuff.
Mhm.
Um, Secondly, if you are an editor with a newsroom, I think it's actually very helpful to do this kind of a training for the newsroom as a whole because it puts everyone on the same page for a conversation that is ongoing and that happens day to day. There's not some like magical 3 steps you can take. It's about every single day saying, okay, here, we're doing another story on gun violence. How do we make it new? Just say after every significant story about trauma, 3 questions. What did we do right? What was challenging? And what did we learn that can change our coverage going forward? It's really important to ask as an editor those 3 questions in a conversation with your team. It's really validating and important. What did we do right? Covering violence and trauma makes everybody feel lousy, right? So helping people identify their own good choices is very important. Not just pat on the head stuff, but really, that was a really good interview. That was a really good quote you got. Great image. Those helping people identify their own good choices in trauma drenched material. What was challenging? It's really important for people to be unafraid of confronting actual mistakes, things that were hard, things that you wish you knew more on, whatever. And what are the lessons learned? As a profession, we get better one story at a time, one journalist to journalist, right? That's how we get better. And when we say, how do we cover the beat better? What do we do on the next trial? what do we do the next time there's a mass shooting that's a little bit different? We're actually not only making our reporting better, we're giving ourselves a sense of the future, which is really important when facing
Mhm.
trauma. I would also say to editors, listen to your younger reporters. It's very important to interns and young reporters in the room, early career reporters. You folks are driving a very important conversation going on in newsrooms about sensitivity to trauma victims, about mental health and well being, and newsrooms' duty of care. You've come out of university experiences where you're talking about things like trauma and microaggressions a lot. You're going into a profession where we don't have that kind of language a lot of the time, and sometimes that means managers and young reporters are talking past one another in awkward ways. But I think it's very important that you both sides in this generational argument be listening to one another. The reality is that I know many of the newsrooms I'm speaking in now, I'm speaking in because younger reporters have said, we've got to do something. So don't be afraid of pushing for change. It's really important.
Great. Thank you. Other questions from our participants?
We started a couple minutes late, so I'm happy to run a minute or two over if people want. Their
I feel like
thoughts or
there's been a
queries.
lot of food for thought in this conversation. It's been terrific, and thank you so much for spending the time with us today. And um, I urge everyone to check out the dartcenter.org. There are a lot of wonderful tips and free resources for sure.
Yeah,
Um,
and there's one other thing that I
yeah, go
didn't.
ahead.
I meant to put on a slide and didn't. One of the other really important things in taking care of your well-being as a journalist is that sometimes if you do find yourself being changed in ways that are negative that you really don't like by this work, and the changes stay around for a while, it's very important that you talk to somebody about it. That you don't let it sit isolated. As journalists, we sometimes feel like we got to pull up our socks and get on with it. Trauma does well in an isolated brain. That's the science.
Mhm.
So you want to be thinking about who are your trusted colleagues, who are your trusted mentors. And while I'm not a therapy pusher, I will say that if you're feeling significantly challenged emotionally or changed in unhelpful ways by your work, trauma trained clinicians, the sort of therapists who work with combat veterans and sexual assault survivors, have a toolkit that's very helpful in working with journalists. One pathway for referral to that is something called the Journalist Trauma Support Network. This is a project the Dart Center started up just a couple of years ago, where we are training already experienced therapists in the professional culture of journalism, trying to make a few psychotherapists around the country a little more journalist friendly in their
Hmm.
practice. There are a number of them in the DC, Maryland area and Northern Virginia area. You can find them through the website I just put into the chat, www.jtsn.org. Um, again, I therapy is not the answer to everything, and actually, what research shows is that psychosocial support, our peer support for one another as colleagues, our mentor relationships, all those things are really central to our well-being and are the first thing we need to attend to. But if you do want help, that's one pathway.
Great. Thank you for that. And thank you all for coming to join us today. Again, this is recorded, so we'll make it available to members. And thank you again, Bruce, for joining us. We look forward to speaking with Kate on Wednesday. So thanks very much.
Great to be here with all of you. Keep committing acts of journalism.